Harbor Freight, a company that an awful lot of people love to hate. But you know, Harbor Freight's got some surprises for us. And in my 50 years of woodworking, I've both bought Harbor Freight tools and turned my back on some Harbor Freight things. But what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about the most underrated tool that you can find in Harbor Freight. And let me tell you, it's a surprise. It was a surprise to me because I had to convince myself first before I could talk to you about this. And that took some convincing. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about Harbor Freight's Bauer line of saw blades. Yes, these saw blades will surprise you. Give me a minute and I'll prove it to you, okay? So let's start off with, when we're looking at saw blade, what is it that we are concerned about? Well, there's a few things. Number one is that it cuts straight. Now, not all saw blades will do it. If that plate, if the metal plate is not flat and smooth, you can actually end up with a saw blade that's not running true and get a messed up cut. We want to make sure that it doesn't splinter. You know, the splitting that happens especially the backside as the blade comes out. We don't want it to bog down in the wood, okay? Now, those things, those last two are both the factors of a dull blade more than they are the way the blade is made in the first place. But they're things that concern us. All right, so to do those things, what do we need the blade to be? First of all, we need the blade to be flat. As I said a moment ago, the plate itself has got to be very flat, okay? When you put that saw in your table saw or in your radial arm saw or your miter saw and you turn it on, you don't want to see it shaking. You want it to be dead on, okay? It needs to be sharp. Well, that's pretty obvious. That means having the teeth properly ground. And yes, you can get blades with improperly ground teeth. And finally, we concern ourselves about whether or not it can be resharpened. Now, I'm not sure that that one's the right one, but that's something we're concerned about. Okay, so why do we buy more expensive saw blades? Well, to accomplish the things I just said, basically. You know, a lot of people say, well, I need to buy the $100 saw blade because if I don't, I'm not going to get those things. Now, I got to tell you, I am a little bit on the cheap side, okay? And I like things that are budget friendly. And I'll tell you, $100 for a saw blade to me isn't budget friendly. CMT just ran a sale. You know, the orange blades, a lot of people like these things. A lot of people talk about them. And they ran a sale recently, so I bought this. This is my first CMT blade, and I used it for the very first time today, actually. So trying to get a little bit better blade and trying to try it out. Before that, my best blade was this one, which is a Delta blade, okay? But what if I said to you, you don't need expensive saw blades to get those things? Now, again, I'm coming back to the Harbor Freight Bauer blades, which surprised me for how good they are. Now, I've got 4 blades here, okay? I've got a 50-tooth Bauer combination blade. This saw blade has been in my table saw for about 3 months now. As you can see from the marking on here, it gets some pretty heavy use. I've got another Bauer here. This is their 80-tooth, they call it a fine finishing. And this has been in my radial arm saw for a considerably longer time, but as you can see, it doesn't get as heavy a use. Then I've got the CMT that I just mentioned to you, the orange blade, and I've got to say, this is not their best grade, okay? They've got like 3 different grades of blade, but this blade is more than double the cost of the Bauer blades. And then I have here a Delta blade, and I can't even tell you how old this blade is or how much it would cost, because Delta is no longer apparently making saw blades. You cannot find Delta branded saw blades online. I believe this saw blade came to me when I got my radial arm saw 40 years ago. That's how long I've had it. It's been in and out of that saw. It's been resharpened at least once, if not twice, and it's still a good blade. Okay? So I guess to me, I mean, this is our good blade that we're comparing to. All right? So we've got these 4 different blades. Now, let's talk about price. This Bauer 50-tooth blade cost me $19.99. The 80-tooth was a little more at $26.99. The CMT, which, as I said, I just bought, I got it off of Amazon. It was on sale for, I believe it was $34.50 or so. Normally it's about $65, $68, somewhere in there. And probably this Delta, if I was to buy it today, if I could find the equivalent to buy of this Delta, we're probably talking $90 to $100. So that's our comparison between the different blades. All right, now, all 4 of these blades are 10-inch blades. They're all designed to go on the same saws. Okay, There is one slight difference here, and that's with the Delta, is the angle of the teeth is different because it's designed specifically to go on a radial arm saw. And there's a tendency in a radial arm saw to pull itself, the blade will pull it through the wood. And the way you handle that is you go with what's known as a negative rake blade or a zero rake blade, okay? In other words, the blade is not hooked forward as much or it would pull through. The other big difference is that this is what's known as a standard kerf. It's an 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch. That's 0.125 inches thick. The kerf that it makes, or the carbide teeth, are that thick. The rest of these, as are most blades you buy today, are what are known as narrow kerf. And they run about 1/32 of an inch less. They'd be considered 3/32 of an inch saw kerf, or 3/32 of an inch thick blade. So that's a difference, okay? The other big difference you're going to see is in how much carbide there are on the teeth. Now, I've measured all of these. The Bauer blades came in and having, and I'm talking about the depth of the carbide here, about 84 thousandths of an inch, okay? The CMT was a little more at 109 thousandths, and this Delta was right about where that CMT was, but like I said, this has been sharpened a couple times, so it started out higher than where the CMT was. So there is more carbide there. That is a difference. We'll talk about that difference in a minute. But the big thing I'm concerned about, first big thing I'm concerned about, is how do they cut? So I've taken all 4 of these, put them in my table saw, and cut pieces of wood using these saw blades. And obviously the thing we're looking for is tooth marks, okay? Now the best way to see tooth marks is to use a bright light at an angle, okay? And if I put this bright light at an angle, I see a cut right here on the edge. This is the Bauer 50 tooth. I barely see a couple of tooth marks right there. And right here I barely see. I'm only talking like 1/4 of an inch of the cut depth. Okay, so that's the 50 tooth. Here's the 80 tooth Bauer. Here on this edge instead of the bottom edge. Now it could be it went through the other way, okay? I've got a little bit. I actually see more tooth marks on the 80 tooth than I do on the 50 tooth. That's interesting. Same cut. They're both cut 1/2 inch thick or 1/2 inch slice. Down here we've got a knot hole that got in the way, and that did cause a line right here, and that's probably because of the hardness of the wood. And that's it. Here's the CMT. This is a brand new blade. This is the very first time this blade came out of its package and I used it. And I have got more cut marks with this CMT blade than either of the Bauers. And they're basically running right through the middle of the board, right through, all through here. I can see tooth marks on that from that blade, okay? So a more expensive blade is giving me worse results. Now, the Delta, I'll have to say, is kind of a dull blade, okay? It's an old blade. I'm getting ready to send it off for sharpening, and it actually isn't as bad. You know, it's got cut marks. I can see the tooth marks here, but yeah, it's right about like the CMT was. So I'm getting better cut results out of these El Cheapos than I am out of the better blades. What does that tell you? Now here's a piece of wood, actually 2 pieces of wood, that I jointed on my table saw using the 50 tooth Bauer blade and then glued them together. Now, a lot of guys, when they glue things together, especially if they join them on their table saw, will use some heavy duty clamp pressure to clamp these together, okay? To try and close up the gap. I used El Cheapo, these are actually Harbor Freight also, quick action clamps, okay? You can't get a lot of pressure with those, and I've got a nice tight joint all the way through. I have no gaps, either from a crooked cut or from the blade leaving marks, okay? So I got a good clean cut. So what am I saying? I'm saying that we need to take a look at these blades, okay? But here's the biggie. Here's where it really comes down to it, okay? Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this that we sharpen our blades. We resharpen our blades. And this Delta blade is about ready to go off for sharpening. It's been sharpened twice, I believe, before. At least once, I'm sure of, but I'm pretty sure it's been twice. And I can feel it's dull. It needs to be sharpened. And it is going to cost me, for this blade, $19. Now, where am I getting that number from? There's a company that sharpens blades, and they've been putting an ad on my Facebook feed lately, and that's so I a very scientific selection. Yeah, I'll use them because they're the ones that are advertising to me. Okay, so they charge for any blade that is 40 tooth or above. That would mean all these blades. $19 for a 10-inch blade to sharpen it. Okay, $19 to sharpen it. They also charge $15 shipping for up to 4 blades coming in and going out. Okay, so I've got a fourth of $15. Let's just call it $4 to be simple. All right, so I got 19 plus 4 plus 4, $27. I can go over to Harbor Freight and buy this blade to replace it for $19.99. Which is the smarter buy? Now, let me say this before I finish this, okay? I did not test how long the blade will remain sharp. All right, there are differences in carbide, and it is theoretically possible, it may even be quite likely, that that blade and that blade have better quality carbide than these blades do, okay? So, but to test that would be rather expensive and use up an awful lot of wood. This blade, which is still very sharp, and matter of fact, it feels as sharp as this blade. Now, I know my thumb is really highly calibrated. That blade has been on my saw for a few months, and it's still sharp, okay? So, would I be better off spending more money on a higher cost blade? If somebody could prove to me that the carbide in that high dollar blade is better than the carbide in these blades, I would say yes. But absent that proof, I would have to say it's smarter for me to buy a $19.99 blade and treat it as a disposable blade, throwing it away when I'm done with it, instead of spending $60, $80, $100 for a blade that I'm going to spend more money resharpening